Welcome to Books of the Book. We're looking at 1 Thessalonians, and today in particular we'll be looking at 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 through 18. My name is John Pauline, and with me is my pastor, John Ciccarelli. John, tell us a little bit about the passage we're looking at today.
Well, John, here we are in chapter 4, verses 13 through 18, and Paul is really wanting them to be knowledgeable about something, specifically when Christ comes again and what happens in those last times. So let's not waste any time and move forward.
All right. Well, this passage is grounded in a whole series of passages in chapters 4 and 5 where Paul is trying to correct them in some practical areas. And at the beginning of chapter 4, he talks about sexuality, work ethic in verses 9 to 12. And then he shifts to the second coming, about the knowledge that they need to have about the second coming. In chapter 5, he moves on to perhaps the attitude that they have toward the second coming. Okay. Then he gets into some leadership issues, and then even talks about prophecy in chapter 5. And we'll come to those passages later on. But here in 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 to 18, he's trying to correct some misunderstandings that they have about the second coming. And somehow, some people have died in the church. It's only been 6 months, and already they've had some deaths in the church. And these deaths really threw them for a loop. It seems that somehow they believed that Jesus' coming was so soon that they would all just join him together. Now, why would it bother them that some of the people had died? I mean, aren't they going to be resurrected and so on? Well, we know that, but evidently they did not. In Judaism, there was a theory, and Thessalonians perhaps were thinking along these lines, that people who were alive when Jesus comes would be taken up to heaven, but those who died would stay here on earth. Oh. And if that's the case, that meant throughout eternity you'd be separated from your loved ones if they died before Jesus came. Yeah, so in Judaism you had this idea, a little bit of a confused idea about resurrection. Maybe the Thessalonians applied that to Christian faith. I guess the bottom line here is that belief does matter. There's a lot of people that say doctrine isn't important. It's just about our relationship with Jesus. And that's so important. That's really the critical thing. But doctrine is important too. What you believe matters. I remember one of my daughters, when she was young, we didn't know about this till later, but she believed that there were monsters under the bed, and that they're confined under there unless it's totally dark. And so she would ask for the door to be left open or a light to be left on. We could never understand. She wouldn't tell us why she was asking. Beliefs matter, and they affect the way that you live. Sure. And there are some people in today's world who love Jesus, have a relationship with him, but they have beliefs about the second coming that I think Paul would find problematic. So it brings us back to the purpose of prophecy. This is a practical text. Paul isn't talking about the second coming just as intellectual. There's a real issue in the church, and this knowledge is going to help them deal with that problem. So
it's so important, I think the beliefs matter because that determines how we also behave, right? As you said, the whole idea of, I think I had the same monsters under my bed. Yeah. So, but what we believe really does impact us. It's like when I talk with my wife and we talked about raising our children, I said, it's important what we teach them, but discipleship is more caught than it's taught, because it's what we believe is what we really live. We can say we believe things, but what we believe is how we really live our life on that. And I had an experience once when I was going to college studying theology, and one of the things that we had to do was to go out with an evangelist and do visitations and so forth. And there were some good visits, but I remember one visit that I was really disheartened by. And there was a disagreement between someone who was attending the meetings and this evangelist, and they weren't agreeing with our views on prophecy. And I saw this conversation escalate right before my eyes. And it was like the love left the room, the compassion left the room, and it was just about being right. And the person I was with was determined that I am going to win this argument. And the idea, it seemed like, of redeeming and reconciliation was just gone. But that's why there is redemption and reconciliation, because Jesus is coming back again, and we want everyone to be there. But sometimes, our beliefs our doctrines sometimes, they need to impact how we live our lives in a great way.
That's right. Well, let's see what Paul has to say in chapter 4 and verse 13, and I'll mention again that the translations of 1 Thessalonians are my own, so that we can bring out some of the nuances of the Greek, the meanings of certain words. Sometimes the grammar can affect the way that we look at the passage. It doesn't always show up in translation, because translation sometimes is thinking more about how it flows in the English. So there are sometimes the sentence is changed a little bit in translation. Verse 13 says, "But we do not wish you to be ignorant, brothers," there's that family word again, "about those who are asleep, in order that you might not grieve like others who have no hope." Now, he doesn't say died. He says they're asleep. But in the ancient world, sleep was a common metaphor for death, you see. And a lot of times we talk about things in metaphors and analogies. In spiritual life, that's true. Fruit of the Spirit.
Right.
You know, that's an analogy. It's a metaphor. And it helps us to get a handle on some things. Now, Paul had spent only 3 weeks in Thessalonica. These people had a pagan background, and evidently some things were missing. There was a scholar named Adolf Deismann who collected some ancient letters. I talked in an earlier program about digging up ancient letters. Would you read us one of those letters from an ancient Greek person to a friend?
Sure, I'd be happy to. This letter reads, "Irene to Theonophorus and Philo, good comfort. I am as sorry and weep over the departed one as I wept for Didymus. And all things whatsoever were fitting, I have done, and all mine, Epaphroditus, and Thermuthion, and Philion, and Apollonius, and Plaintus. But nevertheless, against such things one can do nothing. Therefore comfort ye one another, fare ye well." You know, that's
Depressing.
It is. But you know, it's really not too unlike kind of the way we experience it today in today's society. And you know, my experience with people in our world today is there is this lack of hope and this sadness, especially when it comes to death and dying. You know, it's like, well, if they don't believe in God, it's just like, well, you know, do what you can, you know, but you just kind of get through it. But just this sadness and this grief. And in the United States, you know, we are entering for the first time a post-Christian society where there's a gap between the generations of people who do not and have not attended church. And so there's a growing lack of hope, I think, in our society, because the message of Christ, you know, so needs to be heard, and the hope of His resurrection.
Well, the whole circle of life thing, environmentalism, it's just like, you know, everything's just cycling through. There's really no future. It's just more of the same. I think a lot of that. Paul's concerned. He says Christians should grieve differently. He's not saying Christians shouldn't grieve. He's saying Christians grieve differently because they know some things that take the sting out of it.
And, you know, and I'm glad that he said that in a sense, because our theology is really no good unless it impacts how we live. I love astronomy. I love looking at the stars, you know, and the planets. And when I was looking for a telescope to buy, I went to this store, and it's supposed to be the biggest showroom of telescopes in North America. And I was on that showroom floor, and there were so many telescopes to look at. And I finally asked the gentleman, I said, you know, knowing my price range, and I narrowed it down to about 3, I said, which is the best telescope for me, would you say? And he said, well, there's only one answer. He says, the best telescope is the one that gets used. So he said, which one are you going to use the most? Because that's the best one for you. And I think, you know, the best theology is the one that gets used. And so when we look at this, the hope of Christ coming back again, it ought to impact how we live our lives. And yes, we can grieve. We can be sad for the loss of someone, but it's not without hope. There's that grief of loss. We should be sad that we lost someone very close to us. But yet, underneath that grief, there's hope. We're going to see them again. We're going to be with them again. Just like I mentioned in a previous episode, telling my dad, I'll meet you by the tree. You know, there's that hope that we're going to see each other again. So it's okay. It's okay to have joy and loss at the same time. And, there are some natural stages also to death and dying that we can be aware of. And just real simply, the first one is denial. No, this is not happening. We don't accept it. It's like we have shock. And then we become angry at the situation, and maybe even angry at God, in that. And then we move from anger to kind of a bargaining stage. Okay, God, maybe if you do this, I'll do this, and if we can work this out, we try to make bargains with God. And then maybe we slip into some depression as well about the situation. And then finally there's acceptance. But I think the passage that we're looking at today, Paul gives us that hope to remind us that, remember, this is not the end of the story. There's more to it.
Well, I remember when my mom died, and that was a very traumatic moment in many ways. But she donated her body to science, and so we didn't have a memorial till a month later when everybody could come in. And it was amazing. It was almost like a roast. I mean, we were telling funny stories and stuff that she had said, some of the little quirks and so forth. And for 2 hours, we were celebrating somebody who had brought us so much joy. And I thought, wow, that is different than a lot of funerals. And it's all because of this passage, that we can grieve, but grieve in a way that there's joy, there's celebration and stuff. It's simply different. Funerals are different when you grasp Paul's message here. Verse 14 is where he brings in the solution, and we want to really catch this before the break. 1 Thessalonians 4:14, for if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, so also through Jesus God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep through Jesus. Now, I put that in twice in my translation because it's unclear what the through Jesus is about. And scholars have debated back and forth. But the point I want to make right now, and we'll come back to that after the break. The point I want to make right now is this. Paul says, our view of the resurrection, our view of the future hope is all about Jesus.
Yeah.
It's about the resurrection of Jesus. If Jesus died and rose again, then we too, like him, if we die, we will rise again.
Amen.
He was assuring the Thessalonians that they will see these folk again. Yeah. They will come back, and that God is going to bring them just the way Jesus was brought out of the tomb. God will bring them out. And he makes the same point in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 22. And we'll look at the King James Version on this one. 1 Corinthians 15:22. For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. So there's the promise that the resurrection of Jesus guarantees the resurrection of God's people. You see, it isn't a maybe. It isn't, boy, I hope so. The Christian hope is more than hope. The Christian hope is a certainty that what happened to Jesus will happen to those who love Jesus.
That's good news.
And that was the difference in my mom's funeral. And that's the difference when Christians are grieving, because they know what Jesus has done and what he will do.
Amen. Amen.
So that brings us to our break. We thank you for watching.